Amat merat ike tesolderat ikmerut.
Hey y'all, Dave here. Welcome to the introduction video to the series of videos I'll be doing where I'll be discussing basic ideas within epistemology. As you can see, this one's being done a little bit differently. I'm down here in the corner and there's some slides there in front of you. I won't be running off a script in these videos. Instead, I'll just be talking directly to you based on what's on the slide. I feel like that might be slightly easier and it enables me to talk to you a little bit better. To kind of talk directly to you rather than talk at you. I don't know if that makes any sense. But in this series, I'll be discussing some basic ideas in epistemology. I see it being mentioned more and more among atheists, so I thought maybe it might be interesting to do a little series discussing some of the basic ideas, and I'll also be talking about where I think some atheists and skeptics get it wrong, and how epistemology might help us to be better critical thinkers, better skeptics, and just to help our understanding of knowledge be that little bit better. Anyway, let's get on with the chat. So as this is an introduction to epistemology video, one of the first important questions to ask, of course, is what is epistemology? The slide on screen might surprise some, especially the first sentence, because most atheists and skeptics have come to know knowledge from something like this 4-quadrant meme on screen at the moment. Now, many say the words Gnostic and agnostic relate to knowledge, but the Greek word for knowledge was actually episteme. That's the etymology of the word epistemology. Now, the Greeks had more than just one term for knowledge. They had episteme, which is what you see on screen at the moment, and this referred to a kind of propositional knowledge, a sort of scientific knowledge about the world. They also had the term techni, which referred to practical knowledge or technical knowledge, so knowledge how. If we think of the word episteme, we can think of it as something like knowledge of. And the term techni could be thought of in terms of knowledge how. Now, Gnostic and agnostic are very different terms. The term Gnostic generally referred to a sect of religious people. And of course, agnostic came from Huxley originally. So the Greek word for knowledge, at least in this sense, is where epistemology comes from. And the term ology, the etymology of that is the logos, or the discussion, the word, or theory, making epistemology, as you can see on screen, the theory of knowledge. But epistemology doesn't just deal with knowledge of, it also deals with things like knowledge how. We'll move on to that in a moment, but basically epistemology, episteme, knowledge, ology, theory, epistemology, the theory of knowledge. So what you can see on screen at the moment is some of the questions that epistemology deals with. Epistemology is actually quite a big subject within philosophy. As you can tell by having its own branch, it's an old branch of philosophy as well, probably one of the oldest. You can find discussions from the classical skeptics, the Stoics, the people like Plato, Aristotle, all the way up to Descartes, and in modern times there are plenty of modern epistemologists, and epistemology has gone through a lot of changes. Some of the topics are like, what is a belief? What is an opinion? What's the difference between an opinion and knowledge? Do we have knowledge just because we have a true belief, or does it take something a little bit more? Do we have to have a certain amount of certainty? Do we have to have absolute certainty? Just what is knowledge? It deals with things like rationality and when can we say we know something? And a big question is, why should we prefer knowledge? Why is knowledge important? These are some of the questions that we'll be looking at throughout this series, along with David Hume's problem of induction, Karl Popper's falsification. We'll discuss Thomas Kuhn's scientific revolutions and a lot more. And some delves into skepticism, obviously, because this channel aims to discuss with skeptics and to help you improve your skepticism. So a question here now. think to yourself, what is a belief? Now, I see online a lot of atheists and skeptics argue that belief and knowledge are entirely different, or a belief is when we accept something and we have no evidence for it, because once we have evidence, it's no longer a belief and it's knowledge. But that's not quite true when it comes to epistemology. In epistemology, belief is actually a neutral term. I know it's popular in atheist and skeptic circles to call belief something that we accept as true without evidence, because once we have evidence, it's no longer a belief, it's knowledge. But in epistemology, that's not quite how it works. What they're referring to is something called a mere belief. And these are things that we'll discuss shortly. But in epistemology, as I say, belief is a neutral term. It simply refers to any proposition that we affirm. Now, propositions are something else that we'll be going into a bit deeper later on, but for now, as a basic understanding, a belief is when we accept some truth-apt declarative statement about some state of affairs. So when something is truth-apt, what we mean is that it can be true or false. So something like George Washington was the first president of the USA, or Rishi Sunak is the current Prime Minister of the UK, or the moon orbits the Earth. These are all things that can be true or false. In this case, they're all true, but we could say something like the moon is made of green cheese. That's also something that's truth-apt and false. So a belief is basically just whenever we think one of these statements is true. And that's basically all that it is in epistemology. It's completely neutral. It doesn't say anything to how certain you are. It doesn't say anything to whether or not it's true, how justified you are, or anything like that. It's basically just anything we think is true. And so this is what I was just speaking about when I was speaking about mere belief. A mere belief is something we think is true without any kind of justifications or evidence or good reason. It's just something we believe. But an opinion isn't always just a mere belief. When we think about something that we have an opinion on, oftentimes we'll have justifications for why we think that is the case. An opinion can be wrong or right, same with a mere belief. We might get accidentally lucky with a mere belief and believe a true thing, but it's still mere belief because we don't have any justifications. And an opinion can be true or false, it's just that we can't necessarily prove it to be true, even if we have justifications for believing it. There are certain things that we can't prove to be true, like we might have justifications for believing that the Sex Pistols are the best punk band out there, or an opinion on who the best Prime Minister of the UK of all time was. But we might not necessarily be able to prove it true, even though we have justifications for believing that particular thing. So there's a difference between mere belief and opinion, and as I just stated, a belief isn't necessarily something bad, because a belief, like an opinion, can be justified or unjustified. It can be true, it can be false. I can understand why belief has become something of a dirty word in atheist and skeptic communities. After all, you have a lot of people leaving religion and they see belief as something that has caused them harm, and beliefs are less certain. But when it comes to epistemology, understanding that beliefs are something neutral is important, because as we'll see as we go on, belief and knowledge are often seen as two things that are linked. And so here's an interesting and important question to ask ourselves when it comes to knowledge, and one of the things that is asked in epistemology. Can we know something that's false? Or can we know something that's not true? And what I mean here is not to say can we know that something isn't true, but can we have knowledge of something that is false? So as you can see on the screen, can we know that the Earth is flat, or the moon is made of green cheese, or that Abraham Lincoln is the current president of the USA? All of these things are false, and we might even have justifications for believing these things. But if it's false, can we say that we have knowledge of it? We can claim to know it, but do we actually know it? And this is an important question to ask ourselves. Does knowledge have to be true? So from what we just discussed, it seems to be the case that in order for us to know something, that thing must actually be the case. It must be true. We can't say that we know the current president of the US is Abraham Lincoln if the current president of the US is not Abraham Lincoln. So if a belief is something that we think is true, then is true belief enough for knowledge? Is it enough to say that we know that the current Prime Minister of Britain is Rishi Sunak if we just believe it's true? And it is true. So let's look at this case here. Your phone rings, and this causes you to suddenly remember that you haven't spoken to your friend Dave in a while, or if you haven't got a friend Dave, just make up some other name. And this prompts you to think, oh, wait a minute, I haven't heard of Dave for a while. This must be him calling. And when you answer it, it's Dave on the other end. Your belief was true, but would you say that you had knowledge that it was Dave that was calling you, or were you just lucky? Another example could be something like your friend picks 6 numbers on a lottery, and she thinks to herself, these are the numbers that are going to come up. I believe that these are the numbers that are going to come up. That night the lottery is drawn, and those numbers come up. She had a true belief, but did she have knowledge of the numbers that were going to be drawn? In both of these examples, it seems to be that, well, they had a true belief. They didn't really have knowledge. There seems to be something missing in order for us to call it knowledge. Stop and have a think here about what extra things you might think is needed for knowledge. So, going by the examples that we've just thought about, it seems to be then that knowledge is something more than just true belief. We can have true beliefs that aren't knowledge. So what is it that gives us knowledge? As I said before, we often see atheists and skeptics online saying that once we have evidence for something, it's no longer belief, it's knowledge. So evidence seems to be something that is necessary to give us knowledge, but when we think about that, there's often times where we find that there has been evidence. The evidence has shown something that's false. I mean, if you think about the flat earthers, a lot of them present evidence that the earth is flat, and they believe what they believe based on the evidence that they're presented with. Knowledge requires something a little more than just evidence. It needs to be good evidence. So it seems that knowledge is something more akin to justified true belief. We must think something is true, that thing must be true, and we must have good justifications for believing that it's true. And so we come to what is known as the JTB theory of knowledge, or the tripartite theory of knowledge. And the JTB theory of knowledge states that we have knowledge if and only if we believe some proposition. That proposition is true, and we are justified in believing that proposition. So this seems to be what we can conclude from what we've just mentioned. So along came Edmund Gettier a while ago, and he introduced what are known as Gettier cases, something that we'll discuss in further detail. But Gettier showed that we can have justifications for believing something, but those justifications don't seem to hold up when it comes to considering that we have knowledge. They just seem to be something that gets us there in a sort of lucky-ish way. So justification doesn't seem to be quite enough for it to be knowledge, because if we can get there through justifications, and those justifications just get us there in a lucky sense, then knowledge seems to require more than just justifications. It needs to be good justifications, and justifications that aren't lucky. And so another idea when it comes to knowledge is that knowledge requires certainty. This is something that Descartes kind of discusses in his methodological doubt, that we must start from a foundation where we are absolutely certain and build from that. And for some people, that's mostly what they mean when they say that they know something, that they're certain that something is true. But does being certain that something is true necessarily mean that we know it? I can be absolutely certain that the moon is made of green cheese, but to say that I know the moon is made of green cheese doesn't quite hold out. And think of a case like some student goes to take his exams, and while doing the exams he gets very nervous and he freezes and he's uncertain that he knows the answer to these questions, but he scores absolutely perfect on the test. Does his lack of certainty mean that he didn't know the answers, or did it just mean that he was unconfident about what he knew? So it seems that certainty isn't necessary for knowledge, and it also isn't sufficient for knowledge. We don't have to be absolutely certain about something in order to know it, and this kind of leads into science. Science never claims to be absolutely certain about anything, but yet we would consider a lot of what science gives us to be knowledge. And so these are also some of the things that we'll be looking at in the upcoming series, and we'll also be looking at Descartes' methodological doubt and how it can help you improve your own skepticism. Now, I've already done something quickly on this, and you can also find me writing about this on the Answers and Reasons site. I'll put links to these things in the description if you want to go check them out. And so, in contemporary epistemology, knowledge has moved beyond the JTB theory and beyond Cartesian certainty. We no longer think that knowledge must be infallible. We allow ourselves for the idea that we can have knowledge, even though in the future that knowledge might be displaced by some new information and new theory. Science often works like this. So science works according to a fallibilistic theory of knowledge, but knowledge still seems to be something that's kind of difficult to pin down, and we still have questions of skepticism. Not skepticism in the kind that most people in the skeptic and atheist community think of, but more in the Pyrrhonian or academic skepticism sort, where it's questions of whether knowledge is even possible. And this relates to something called Munchausen's trilemma. It shows that knowledge is something that may not even be possible. Something we'll be looking at later on in this series. I'll dedicate a video to it in itself because it's a very interesting dilemma or trilemma. And so understanding all these things can help us to answer the question I asked at the beginning, and an important question in epistemology of why knowledge is important and why should we prefer knowledge to opinion. I'm sure you have plenty of answers to that yourself, and some of these are pretty common sense stuff. I mean, in medicine, of course, we should prefer knowledge of how to heal people to an opinion on how to heal people. Understanding medicine and electronics has helped us to improve society, so we can see why knowledge is important in those areas. But should it be important to everybody? What should be important? Why should we prefer it? If these knowledges don't make any real difference to our lives, should we prefer it? Is it entirely subjective, or do we have objective reasons to prefer knowledge? And again, this is something that we'll be looking at later on in the series. And so there we have it. We're at the end of this little introduction. Hopefully this gives you some idea of what we're going to be doing in this little series, and hopefully you'll see how I'm going to be approaching it through slideshows and a little discussion like this. I won't be going into super huge technical details because this series isn't aimed at that kind of person. It's aimed at the person who just wants to know a little bit better, or is interested in the idea of epistemology and wants to help to use it to be a better skeptic, be a better thinker. In the future, we'll be looking at Descartes' methodological doubt because that's a pretty important thing when it comes to good skepticism. We'll also be looking at the problem of induction because that's an important thing when it comes to understanding science. Get to your problems I mentioned earlier, which are challenges to the justified true belief theory of knowledge. And we'll also be looking at other theories of knowledge, and we'll be discussing things like fallibilism and infallibilism and foundationalism and things like that in a little more detail in the future. And as I know science is popular in the atheist and skeptic community, we'll be looking at two influential philosophers of science, Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn, along with a lot more other things. So hopefully you've enjoyed this little introduction, and hopefully it's given you a few things to think about and some idea of what's to come, and hopefully you'll enjoy what's to come. So that's it for now. I'll see you all again soon. Until then, I hope life treats you well. Take care. Bye.